Hello, friends, and welcome to the Diabetes Pro Tip series from the Juicebox Podcast. These episodes have been remastered for better sound quality by Rob at Wrong Way Recording. When you need it done right, you choose Wrong Way. WrongWayRecording.com. Initially imagined by me as a 10-part series, the Diabetes Pro Tip series has grown to 26 episodes. These episodes now exist in your audio player between episode 1000 and episode 1025. They are also available online at diabetesprotip.com and juiceboxpodcast.com. This series features myself and Jennifer Smith. Jenny is a CDE and a Type 1 for over 35 years. This series was my attempt to bring together the management ideas found within the podcast in a way that would make it digestible and revisitable. It has been so incredibly popular that these 26 episodes are responsible for well over 500,000 downloads within the Juicebox Podcast. While you're listening, please remember that nothing you hear on the Juicebox Podcast should be considered advice, medical or otherwise. Always consult a physician before making any changes to your healthcare plan or becoming bold with insulin. If you're living with diabetes or are the caregiver of someone who is, and you're looking for an online community of supportive people who understand, check out the Juicebox Podcast private Facebook group, Juicebox Podcast Type 1 Diabetes. There are over 41,000 active members, and we add 300 new members every week. There is a conversation happening right now that would interest you, inform you, or give you the opportunity to share something that you've learned. Juicebox Podcast Type 1 Diabetes on Facebook. And it's not just for Type 1s. Any kind of diabetes, any way you're connected to it, you are invited to join this absolutely free and welcoming community. This episode of the Juicebox Podcast is sponsored by Ascensia Diabetes, makers of the Contour Next Gen blood glucose meter. And they have an amazing offer for you. Right now, at my link only, contournext.com/juicebox free meter, you can get an absolutely free Contour Next Gen starter kit. That's contournext.com/juicebox free meter. While supplies last, U.S. residents only. The Remastered Diabetes Pro Tip series from the Juicebox Podcast is sponsored by Touched by Type 1. See all of the good work they're doing for people living with Type 1 diabetes at touchedbytype1.org and on their Instagram and Facebook pages. This show is sponsored today by the glucagon that my daughter carries, Gvoke HypoPen. Find out more at gvokeglucagon.com/juicebox. In the episode about insulin, I told you that my nurse practitioner, CDE, told us that fear of insulin was the biggest sticking point for people making good decisions with their diabetes.
Right.
And after I got past my fear of insulin, the next hurdle I had to get past was pre-bolusing. And I am now, years and years later, at a time where I will tell you that if you do not pre-bolus a meal, the likelihood of success is near zero. And if you have success without pre-bolusing, all that means is that you gave yourself too much insulin prior to that, and it's just catching up now. And so this is it. We're going to talk about pre-bolusing, and we're going to talk about about insulin action, right? The action of the insulin and how to balance it against the impact of the carbs or your body function. So tell me, let's go over the part that people aren't going to find comforting at first, right? Which is the amount of time it takes insulin to begin working in a person varies person to person and insulin to insulin. Is that pretty fair to say?
It's pretty fair to say, yes. And insulin to insulin, I would definitely say most of the rapids on the market should be fairly similar.
Okay.
The rapid acting insulins on the market and their time of action should be fairly similar. Now, person to person, yes, that may vary.
Situation to situation as well,
Situation to situation, it may vary. But again, that's the learning part of it.
Okay. So person to person could end up meaning just your body chemistry. It could mean where your infusion set is.
right?
Or your injection site.
Right.
Absolutely.
Say you're a person who gets stuck on, I always inject in my belly in the same place. That spot might not be as reactive to the insulin as if you would just try a new spot. If you went to a new spot, it might work quicker than it has been in your old spot.
Right.
If you're wearing an infusion set, it could, we alluded to it before, you could get better action from your insulin on day 1 than you do on day 3, or better on day 2 than, 2 hours after you've put it on. There's a lot of different variables, but we're speaking generally here
Yes.
You'll apply them to your variables later. Now, if you've heard this podcast before, you'll know that I have alluded to how insulin works in a number of different ways. So I'm going to give my kind of cartoony description of it, and then we're going to let Jenny talk about it for real.
Cartoony might be better, actually.
We'll see. So here's how I picture it in my head, a couple of different ways. The first way is I think of a tug of war. And I imagine a rope with a flag hanging in the middle of it. And on one side of this tug of war rope is insulin, and on the other side is your carbs and your body function. It could be adrenaline, it could be fear, it could be anxiety, whatever helps to drive your blood sugar up. That stuff's on one side of the rope, the insulin's on the other side. Unlike a tug of war in a schoolyard, our goal is not for one side to win. Our goal is for them both to pull and pull and pull until they get exhausted and they both go, I can't do this anymore, and they drop the rope and our flag's still in the center. That flag represents the blood sugar you start at when the impact of the carbs begins, in my mind. So I'll explain a little more. If you let them both start pulling at the same time, the carbs are generally speaking going to gain power and momentum before the insulin begins to work. So now your rope is going towards a high blood sugar and you're starting to head up. Now suddenly you're 50 points higher. And what if you started with 150 blood sugar? Now you're at 200. And now these carbs have momentum, they have speed, they're pulling your blood sugar up. Now all of a sudden, 15, 20, 30 minutes later, the insulin's like, oh, no, wait, I have a job to do, I remember. And it kind of comes online. But now it's pulling. It can't overpower the momentum that the carbs have created. Plus, you now have another 100 points of blood sugar to contend with, and all you have is the insulin that you counted your carbs for. So even if you counted your carbs perfectly and realized that this meal is 5 units, once the momentum of the carbs is rocketing your blood sugar up, once you have a number that is higher than you started with, those 5 units are not even going to begin to cover what's happening, let alone the food that you've put in. But if you put the insulin in first and let the insulin come online slowly and begin to pull down and create the momentum in the other way, then you flip the script. And now the carbs are fighting. So instead of having a fight at 180 blood sugar, you're having a fight at an 80 blood sugar. And instead of your blood sugar falling at 80, the attempt is that it's now trying to be pulled up by the carbs. And that's how, when you see people with a stable graph, that's how they're doing it. And so for me, in a perfect situation for me, my daughter's blood sugar is diagonal down when I give her most foods. Mm-hmm. There's differences, food to food, situation to situation. But in a perfect world, to me, that's it. You want your insulin working, your blood sugar trending down, creating some momentum down when you allow the carbs to begin to pull up.
Correct.
Now, you explain that in a technical way that sounds better.
And in most settings, yes, that's 100%. I mean, insulin, our rapid, I've always thought that rapid is such a misnomer. Honestly, rapid indicates like now. Rapid is
light switch.
Click, 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 light switch, it's on, it's working. And it's, still education is take your insulin and start to eat. I mean, even from most endo offices, it's take your insulin and start to eat. It's going to be working very, very quickly. That's not the case. Right. And anybody who's been taking insulin long enough and you've seen the spikes and you've seen the issues, despite counting your carbs as precisely and weighing them and everything, and you're still seeing these issues, it's the mismatch of insulin timing. Mm-hmm. It is. So our rapids take anywhere between about 15 to 30 minutes to really get that active peak, not peak, but that active phase where then when you start putting your carbs in, they will match, as you said. The carb digestion will start to match with the insulin. You'll get a nice gentle curve up, and it should then start to curve back down. Yeah. And there is a lot of education that also focuses on, as you mentioned, watching for that curve down. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Watching for the curve down to start so that you know the insulin is already moving things.
Yep. Yeah. And to give you some context, a person I spoke about in a previous episode who was having trouble told me, but what am I going to do? I'm going to be scared. I said, well, try it a little bit this time and then a little more next time and a little more next time and go forward. And so I always tell this story somewhere, and I think here's the right place to tell it. Prior to glucose sensing technology being a thing that anyone knew about, prior to, Dexcom, I was again in the office, and the CDE says to me, "Hey, you're going to get one of those Dexcom things." And I thought, I don't know what that is, And she starts telling me it's a continuous glucose monitor, and I'm like, yeah, I again don't know. And then she tells me this simple story. There's a 17-year-old boy in her practice who loves candy. A certain kind of candy, and he can't figure out how to bolus it. So he gets a Dexcom, whatever the first one was. I don't even remember anymore. His whole goal was to eat this candy without a spike. So he goes out to the store, and he buys like little grab bags of these candies, a number of them, enough for a week. And every day starts on this experiment. First day, just like you said, eats, gives himself his insulin, just like he'd been told his whole life. Blood sugar goes up, 220, something like that, sits there forever. Eventually, he has to give himself more insulin to bring it back down again. Next day, he tries a little sooner, gives himself a few minutes, 5-10 minutes, gets a little less of a rise. So the next day, he goes even sooner. And then before you know it, it's a little sooner, a little more. And he starts adjusting it back and forth, a little more, a little sooner, a little later, until one day he eats the candy and his blood sugar never moves. And she tells me that story, and I thought immediately, wow, that means it's possible.
Yes.
Like that was the first time I thought. I was like, if that kid can do it with candy, I can do it with anything. Like anything, right? And so, yes, give me that CGM, please. And I got it, and I started, dispense with my fear, and I started learning about it. There were hiccups along the way, right? I've given her insulin, and she's gotten lower than I meant for her to when she's eating, but once, twice. Right. I'll go back to this over and over again. When something goes wrong, it's not a mistake. It's a learning experience. It's data for next time, right?
Right.
So I put the insulin in, and she goes down to 70 and sits at 70 while she's eating. It's beautiful. Like there she goes. And then a spike. Even if I really messed up on the amount of insulin I used, a spike takes you to 120.
Right.
Right. It's not right. It's all about that timing and amount. And I repeat it over and over again that all the things you and I are going to speak about, all the things that people hear about on this podcast, if you want to know how to use your insulin, at its core, the very first step is timing and amount. If you can use the right amount at the wrong time, you can use the wrong amount at the right time. It's too much. You have to have the right amount of insulin at the right time. You have to balance the action of the insulin against the impact of the carbs. If you do that, I don't want to say it's easy, because that's insulting to people. But let me just say, I don't think about diabetes that much anymore.
It's easier.
It's much easier.
If you do that, it is easier. Absolutely. And it's a lot more, it gives you a lot more visual then to understand, because it's not so much of an unknown. Well, gosh, I counted the carbs and I took the right amount of insulin, and this is always happening to me. Why? And if you can start to put those pieces together, it's not a why anymore. It's like turning the light bulb on.
Here's how I explain what Jenny just said.
Touched by Type 1 has a wide array of resources and programs for people living with type 1 diabetes. When you visit touchedbytype1.org, go up to the top of the page where it says Programs. There you're going to see all of the terrific things that Touched by Type 1 is doing. And I mean, it's a lot. Type 1 at school, the D-Box program, Golfing for Diabetes, Dancing for Diabetes, which is a terrific program. You just click on that to check that out. Bowl for a Cause, their awareness campaigns, and the annual conference that I've spoken at a number of years in a row. It's just amazing, just like Touched by Type 1. Touchedbytype1.org, or find them on Facebook and Instagram. Links in the show notes. Links at juiceboxpodcast.com to Touched by Type 1 and the other great sponsors that are supporting the remastering of the Diabetes Pro Tip series. touchedbytype1.org. The Remastered Diabetes Pro Tip series is sponsored by Ascensia Diabetes, makers of the Contour Next Gen Blood Glucose Meter, and they have a unique offer just for listeners of the Juicebox Podcast. If you're new to Contour, you can get a free Contour Next Gen starter kit by visiting this special link, contournext.com/juiceboxfreemeter. When you use my link, you're going to get the same accurate meter that my daughter carries. contournext.com/juiceboxfreemeter. Head there right now and get yourself the starter kit. This free kit includes the Contour Next Gen meter, 10 test strips, 10 lancets, a lancing device, control solution, and a carry case. But most importantly, it includes an incredibly accurate and easy to use blood glucose meter. This Contour meter has a bright light for nighttime viewing, an easy to read screen. It fits well in your hand and features second chance sampling, which can help you to avoid wasting strips. Every one of you has a blood glucose meter. You deserve an accurate one. contournext.com/juiceboxfreemeter to get your absolutely free Contour Next Gen starter kit sent right to your door. When it's time to get more strips, you can use my link and save time and money buying your Contour Next products from the convenience of your home. It's completely possible that you will pay less out of pocket in cash for your Contour strips than you're paying now through your insurance. contournext.com/juiceboxfreemeter. Go get yourself a free starter kit. While supplies last, U.S. residents only. When you have diabetes and use insulin, low blood sugar can happen when you don't expect it. Gvoke HypoPen is a ready-to-use glucagon option that can treat very low blood sugar in adults and kids with diabetes ages 2 and above. Find out more. Go to gvokeglucagon.com/juicebox. Gvoke shouldn't be used in patients with pheochromocytoma or insulinoma. Visit gvokeglucagon.com/risk.
Here's how I explain what Jenny just said. I think of it as this equation that it's a mathematical equation that doesn't have any math in it. I did this, that happened. So next time I'll do more, less, sooner, a little less, a little more, that kind of a thing. And right. I always just keep looking at it like that. I did this and that happened. It's the idea of being in a fist fight and you want to hit first because now you have cause and effect, right? And if you and so now I've done something and that's what happened next. Now I can make a good decision about what I do next instead of waiting for diabetes to do something to you and then you're just covering up your face hoping not to get knocked out, right? Like because you don't know what's happening, you don't know why it's happening, you have no context for what's going on. But when you make the first move, you can be sure that what happens next was impacted by what you did. I put insulin in 10 minutes before you ate, 10 minutes before I ate, and my blood sugar went to 150. So the next time I'm going to try 15 minutes. And if it goes to 130, I might try 20 minutes. And, if I get low then later, I might say, okay, I might need a little more, a little less. Now, here's where people always say, well, how much, Scott? How long? Give me the time, give me the amount. That answer for me is always going to be, I don't know, figure it out for yourself. Right. Okay? You have to.
This is the starting place.
Yes.
This is where to start. This is how to start. You have to do your own. I mean, diabetes is a science experiment. It's a daily, I feel like every day you're almost given like this new petri dish and you're told, keep the dots growing purple today. Okay. Let's work on keeping the dots growing purple. And then something green pops in and then these like little horny pink things pop out and you're like, but it's a science experiment that for the most part, when you figure out what does work, the timing around the most typical foods that you eat and whatnot, it takes a lot less thinking out of the equation.
Yeah. And while this isn't about pre-bolus and it'll come up later, but it's important for me to say, because I think this is impactful. When you really stop and think about your habits around food, they're pretty similar.
They are.
Right. So, you're not, I always say it like this, like if you're a person who gets a pizza on a Friday night and has 2 slices, you don't suddenly next Friday have 7 slices. You don't go from being a 2-slice person to a 7-slice person, right? Like so you can start making these decisions about how much insulin and when, and you can make them based on historical knowledge about what's going on.
I usually tell people as the pre-bolus piece, most people have about 20 to 25 foods that are the most common for you to eat regularly.
Yeah.
That's at least 80% of your control there, at least.
Right.
So if you can nail the bolus timing around those and figure it out, for the most part, variations in setting will happen, whatever.
Yeah.
But for the most part, if you've figured that out, you're also much more likely to be able to figure out food that isn't your norm because of the similarities to what you've chosen and what you're usually eating.
Because you can stay flexible. I call it staying fluid, right?
Yep.
And so here's where I'll tell people this. Don't get mad. I don't count carbs. I actually think about it a little backwards from maybe how most of you think about it. I don't look at the food and say, weigh it or measure it and say, okay, well, that's 25 carbs. And my pump says that I get 1 unit for every 10. So that's 2.5 units. In honesty, there is no accurate insulin to carb ratio set up in Arden's pump. I don't even pay attention to that. I look at a plate and I say to myself, that's 7 units. I think that if she's going to sit down and gorge herself on nachos and cheese, the last time that happened, it took 10 units. I think of it as insulin, not as carbs. And of course, that takes a little practice, right?
It does.
And it is a little contingent on you having a CGM. I'm not going to lie about that, right?
Yeah.
Because I start with a healthy pre-bolus, and healthy would mean in amount and time. And then I watch her CGM. And I don't really watch it. I have her tolerances set tightly enough that if she leaves that range, I find out about it. So as an example, if I were to give Arden something incredibly carb heavy, I might use a temp basal increase and a pre-bolus to try to spread out the action of the insulin across this timeline where there's going to be these carbs.
Right.
If I make a bolus and 30 minutes after I do it, she's 120, 130 diagonal up, I look at that line and it tells me something based on my previous knowledge. I say to myself, ooh, this I missed. Like this isn't enough insulin. And I will give her more. I will bump it and nudge it back. It's not a ton more. It's enough to stop the arrows.
Right. And the arrows are very important to bring up in this as well, because if you are using a CGM, those arrows do indicate a rate of change. And again, that's not something that most people realize. They don't understand that, and not understand. People aren't stupid. It's that they've not been told. They've not been told, hey, these arrows tell you that you're increasing by 30 to 60 points in the next 30 minutes. Okay, if that's the case and I know what my kind of correction factor is or whatever, I can say, okay, I'm going to need this much more insulin, because if I don't correct my rising 130 blood sugar, in the next 30 minutes, I could be 30 to 60 points higher. I could be as high as 190. I don't want to be 190. I've obviously miscalculated someplace. I can throw in a bit more insulin to counter that expected and stabilize it.
Yes, yeah. It very much is remembering to, I guess the way I usually say it is that you have to trust that what you know is going to happen, right?
Yes.
You see, and I think that the least important aspect of what the Dexcom does is the number. It's the direction and the speed.
Yes.
Direction and speed.
100%. I wish more. Please say that again. It is the direction. It's the trend. It is not just the number.
Yeah, the number's nice. Like, don't get me wrong. It's a starting point. But, if you're 60 and stable and you haven't had insulin for 3 hours and you haven't had food for 3 hours, well, maybe you could get away with like a temp basal decrease of 100% for a half an hour. Maybe you'll rise to 90, right? But if you're 60 and you're falling, well, then you don't have enough time because as we've now discussed over and over again, insulin doesn't begin working right away. Also, temp basals are insulin. It's funny how people think of bolusing and basal as different, but once you're on a pump, it's the same thing.
It is.
You can't just turn your basal off and it starts happening right away.
Takes about 60 minutes for circulating insulin level to be different.
And I always try to think of it a little bit as like Arden's pre-bolus time. Like if Arden's pre-bolus time is 20 minutes, well then setting a temp basal is not really going to start working for at least 20 minutes. Plus, it's a fraction of the basal rate. If you're getting a unit an hour and I say to it, okay, let's double it. Let's double it to 2 units an hour. That impact of that doesn't begin for 20 minutes or so. Plus, it's not the whole unit extra. It's the fraction of it. So when we talk about basal, we'll get to that. But so pre-bolusing is really just the idea of balancing, again, the action of the insulin against the impact of the carbs, giving yourself a chance, not letting the carbs wash you away. Because here's what happens when the carbs wash you away. You count your carbs exactly right. You put your insulin in. You spike up to 200. When that happens, that insulin was only for the food. It wasn't for the 200 blood sugar, and it wasn't for the momentum of the rise. And so when I see that, like, I guess an easier way to say it is this. When I don't have time for a pre-bolus, and pre-bolusing to me is never about the number. You can pre-bolus a 65 blood sugar. You can pre-bolus a 90 blood sugar because still, no matter what, if you're stable at 65, the insulin you put in is not going to start working until it starts working. So don't get me wrong. If I see a 65 blood sugar and Arden needs 10 units for what she's eating, I don't put all 10 units in at a 65.
Right.
I might do an extended bolus, which we'll talk about in extended boluses, but I get some insulin moving. I make sure the insulin's on the winning side of this tug of war to start. Right. But in a situation where I can't pre-bolus, let's say I know the meal is 5 units, 100% certain it's 5 units. But for whatever reason, life, let's call it, I can't pre-bolus. And Arden's, I'm going to start eating right now. I'll give her 7 units. Mm-hmm. Because I bolus for the food, the 5 units for the food I knew, and I'm pre-bolusing the rise I know is coming and the number I know is coming. So I'm already treating a high blood sugar that hasn't happened yet because I know it's going to happen because I didn't pre-bolus.
Right. John Walsh goes into detail about what you're doing in a little bit of a different way. He calls it super bolus.
I call it over bolusing.
He calls it super bolus in the way that you take that 5 units, let's say in your example, and let's say your basal behind that meal for the next 2 hours is 1 unit an hour. Mm-hmm. You actually take your basal running for the next 2 hours and you add it into the bolus for the meal and you take it all up front. Oh. And then to decrease the chance of being too low later because of so much upfront action and the blood sugar staying normal, you actually set a temporary basal decrease. He recommends starting with 100% because you've loaded that onto the front to avoid a low on the back end. Some people find, though, that a temp basal 100% off is too much. They only need a 50%. They still calm the spike and prevent it, but in the back end, they're not having a low then. So similar kind of concept, yeah.
I consider that trading bolus for basal.
Yeah.
So say 120 diagonal up 30, 40 minutes after a meal, and I go, oh, geez, I got to stop that arrow. How much do I bolus to stop the arrow? I usually bolus an hour's worth of basal insulin.
Yep.
That way, if the arrow stops and I stay steady and she doesn't go down, I say, okay, well, obviously I was just wrong on the initial amount. But in those situations where you push the button, the unit and a half goes in, and 5 seconds later the arrow goes from 122 diagonal up to flat, you go, ooh, I didn't need that.
Right.
Temp basal off. Half hour. All I've done is trade the basal for the bolus.
Absolutely.
Here's a good place to say this, and we'll say this in each of these little vignettes. Never suspend your basal. It's always temporary basals. When you suspend, you're shutting your pump off. When you shut your pump off, it does not turn back on.
You have to remember to turn it back on.
Yes.
Yep.
It's always temporary because you can set a temp basal for a half an hour, 2 hours, but at the end of that time, it goes back. It'll go back on and start delivering your basal insulin again. Always temporary basals, not don't suspend your pump. Okay, so do you think we covered pre-bolus there?
I think that's pretty good. Good, yeah. That's awesome.
I want to thank Ascensia Diabetes for sponsoring the Remastered Diabetes Pro Tip series. Don't forget, you can get a free Contour Next Gen Starter Kit at contournext.com/juicebox free meter. While supplies last, U.S. residents only. If you're enjoying the remastered episodes of the Diabetes Pro Tip series from the Juicebox Podcast, you have Touched by Type 1 to thank. TouchedByType1.org is a proud sponsor of the remastering of the Diabetes Pro Tip series. Learn more about them at touchedbytype1.org. A huge thank you to one of today's sponsors, Gvoke Glucagon. Find out more about Gvoke HypoPen at gvokeglucagon.com/juicebox. You spell that GVOKEGLUCAGON.com/juicebox. Jenny Smith holds a bachelor's degree in human nutrition and biology from the University of Wisconsin. She is a registered and licensed dietitian, a certified diabetes educator, and a certified trainer on most makes and models of insulin pumps and continuous glucose monitoring systems. She's also had type 1 diabetes for over 35 years, and she works at integrateddiabetes.com. If you're interested in hiring Jenny, you can learn more about her at that link. I hope you enjoyed this episode. Now, listen, there's 26 episodes in this series. You might not know what each of them are. I'm going to tell you now. Episode 1000 is called Newly Diagnosed or Starting Over. Episode 1001, all about MDI. 1002, all about insulin. 1003 is called Pre-Bolus. Episode 1004, Temp Basal. 1005, Insulin Pumping. 1006, Mastering a CGM. 1007, Bump and Nudge. 1008, The Perfect Bolus. 1009, Variables. 1010, Setting Basal Insulin. 1011, Exercise. 1012, Fat and Protein. 1013, Insulin Injury and Surgery. 1014, Glucagon and Low BGs. In episode 1015, Jenny and I talk about emergency room protocols. In 1016, Long-Term Health. 1017, Bump and Nudge Part 2. In episode 1018, Pregnancy. 1019, Explaining Type 1. 1020, Glycemic Index and Load. 1021, Postpartum. 1022, Weight Loss. 1023, Honeymoon. 1024, Female Hormones. And in episode 1025, we talk about transitioning from MDI to pumping. Before I go, I'd like to share 2 reviews with you of the Diabetes Pro Tip series, one from an adult and one from a caregiver. I learned so much from the Pro Tip series when our son was diagnosed last summer. It really helped get me through those first few very tough weeks. It wasn't just your explanations of how it all works, which were way better than anything our diabetes educator told us, but something about the way you and Jenny presented everything, even the scary stuff, that reassured me that we could figure out how to deal with this and to teach our son how to deal with it too. Thank you for sharing your knowledge and experience with us. This podcast is a game changer. 25 years as a type 1 diabetic, and only now am I learning some of the basics. Scott brings useful information and presents it in digestible ways. Learning that pre-bolus doesn't just mean bolus before you eat, but means timing your insulin so that it is active as the carbs become active, took me already from a decent 6.5 A1C down to a 5.6 in the past 8 months. I've never met Scott, but after listening to hundreds of episodes and joining him in his Facebook group, I consider him a friend. Listening to this podcast and applying it has been the best thing I have done for my health since diagnosis. I genuinely hope that the Diabetes Pro Tip series is valuable for you and your family. If it is, find me in the private Facebook group and say hello. If you're enjoying the Juicebox Podcast, please share it with a friend, a neighbor, your physician, or someone else who you know that might also benefit from the podcast. Thank you so much for listening. I'll be back very soon with another episode of the Juicebox Podcast.